The Shadow Moon Pack was the largest and most powerful werewolf pack on the continent, a kingdom of muscle, magic and ancient tradition ruled from a palace of dark stone and shimmering silver. Its heart beat with the rhythm of powerful warriors and intricate politics, a world where strength of voice was just as important as strength of claw. And in this world, a young woman named Aurora often felt like she had neither. Aurora was not a warrior. She was not from a high-ranking family. She was a helper to the pack healers, a role she cherished. Her world was one of quiet green things, of fragrant herbs and delicate flowers that held the power to mend wounds and soothe fevers. She understood the language of plants, a silent, gentle tongue of growth and healing. It was the spoken language that often betrayed her. Since she was a small child, her words had come out in a stutter, tripping and stumbling on their way into the world. It made her seem fragile, broken, in the eyes of a pack that valued smooth, commanding speech. On this particular morning, the sun was high, casting long, sharp shadows across the palace courtyards. Aurora clutched a woven basket to her chest, the scent of dried moon blossom and sunroot rising from within. She had been tasked with delivering these special herbs directly to the head cook in the royal kitchens, a simple errand that filled her with a familiar, cold dread. The journey meant walking through the grand hall, a place always bustling with off-duty warriors and high-ranking pack members, the very people whose laughter cut the deepest. She slipped through the towering, carved doors of the hall, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished stone floor. She kept her head down, her long hair acting as a curtain, hoping to become invisible, a ghost moving from one patch of shadow to another. The hall was, as expected, full of life. Groups of men and women in fine leathers and silks talked and laughed, their voices echoing confidently off the high ceiling. Aurora's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She focused on the far archway that led to the kitchens, a beacon of safety. She was almost there. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The voice was sharp, sweet like poisoned honey, and it slithered across the hall, instantly making Aurora freeze. It was Sierra, a young woman known for her beauty, her sharp tongue, and her family's high status. She was flanked by two of her usual friends, a smug, whispering trio that delighted in finding targets for their cruelty. Sierra stepped directly into Aurora's path, a false smile plastered on her face. "What do you have there, little mouse?" "Stealing from the royal pantries." Aurora's grip on the basket tightened until her knuckles turned white. She tried to speak, to explain, but her throat seemed to close. It's FF4. The words stuck, repeating the first sound like a desperate, broken record. A few guards nearby stopped their conversation, turning to watch the spectacle. One of them smirked. Sierra leaned in, her eyes glinting. "For who? For what? Spit it out. We don't have all day." Her friends tittered behind their hands. A deep flush heated Aurora's cheeks and traveled down her neck. She felt tears of frustration and humiliation prick at the corners of her eyes. She took a shaky breath, trying to force the words out. For the KK kitchen, the CC cook." Each stutter felt like a physical blow. The snickers from the guards grew louder. Sierra's smile widened. "The CC cook? Maybe you should stick to watering plants. It's a much quieter job." The cruelty was precise, aimed right at her deepest insecurity. Aurora felt herself shrinking, wanting the floor to open up and swallow her whole. It was at that exact moment that the very air in the grand hall changed. The laughter died in an instant, choked off as if by an unseen hand. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A wave of pure, undiluted power rolled through the vast space, so potent it felt like a physical pressure. Every head, as if pulled by a single string, turned towards the main entrance. Prince Lupus stood there. He was taller than any other man in the room, his shoulders broad and his posture impossibly straight. He wore simple, dark clothes that did nothing to hide the lean, powerful strength coiled in his frame. His hair was the color of raven wings, and his eyes, a stormy, piercing gray, scanned the room. He did not need to speak. His silence was louder than any shout, a heavy, living thing that commanded absolute respect and a threat of fear. He was the silent prince, the future Lycan king, and he had not uttered a single word to anyone in years. His stormy gaze swept over the scene, pausing on Sierra's triumphant face, then dropping to Aurora's tear-filled, downcast one. He saw the basket clutched protectively to her chest, the way her entire body trembled with shame. His expression, usually an unreadable mask of cold stone, shifted. A flicker of something dark and dangerous ignited in the depths of his gray eyes. It was not just anger. It was fury. He took a step forward, then another, his movements fluid and utterly silent. The crowd parted for him like water before a ship's prow. He walked directly towards Sierra, and his focus was so intense, so wholly centered on her, that she took an involuntary step back, her smug smile dissolving into a mask of fear. He stopped mere inches from her, looking down at her. He didn't growl. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stared, and in that stare was a universe of reprimand, a promise of consequences so severe they didn't need to be spoken aloud. Sierra seemed to shrink. "My prince, we were just..." She stammered, her own voice failing her for the first time. She bowed her head low, a gesture of deep submission. "Forgive me." Lupus held his gaze on her for a moment longer, a final, silent warning, before he finally turned away. He then shifted his attention to Aurora. She flinched, expecting his anger to be turned on her for causing a disturbance in his hall. She braced for a look of disgust, for a dismissive wave of his hand. It never came. Instead, his gaze softened. The terrifying storm in his eyes quieted to a gentle, gray calm. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a broken thing but as a person. He slowly reached out, not to touch her, but for the basket she held. His movements were deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When his fingers brushed against hers as he took the basket's handle, a jolt, like a spark of lightning on a dry day, shot through her hand and up her arm. It was warm and electric, a feeling so startling her breath hitched. His eyes widened just a fraction, a barely perceptible reaction that told her he had felt it too. He didn't try to speak. He didn't smile. He simply gave her a small, solemn nod. It was a gesture of thanks, of understanding, of something she couldn't quite name. Then, holding the basket of herbs she had fought so hard to deliver, he turned and continued his silent walk across the hall, disappearing through the far archway as quietly as he had arrived. The spell was broken. The hall remained quiet for a moment longer, then slowly whispers began to rise again, but now they were aimed at Sierra's humiliation, not Aurora's. The guards looked away, suddenly very interested in the stonework of the walls. Aurora stood rooted to the spot, her hand still tingling from the brief, shocking contact. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his fingers against hers. The cold dread that had filled her was gone, replaced by a swirling, confusing warmth. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't pitied her. He had seen her tormentor and silenced her without a word. He had taken her burden from her hands. And in his deep, silent eyes she had seen not mockery, but a shared understanding of what it was like to be different in a world that demanded sameness. Her heart was no longer pounding with fear, but with a strange, new and entirely terrifying hope. The silent prince had noticed her, and nothing would ever be the same again. The encounter in the grand hall replayed in Aurora's mind like a haunting melody for the rest of the day and long into the night. The sting of Sierra's words had been washed away by the shocking, silent intervention of Prince Lupus, leaving behind a confused and restless feeling. She felt seen not for her flaw but in spite of it, and that was a sensation so foreign she didn't know what to do with it. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, and when the dawn's first light painted the sky, she rose from her bed, her thoughts a tangled mess of gray eyes and a warm, electric touch. Seeking the comfort of the only world that made complete sense to her, she decided to skip the morning meal in the crowded great hall. Instead, she slipped away to a place few in the palace ever visited, a forgotten walled garden on the eastern edge of the grounds, hidden behind a crumbling archway choked with ivy. It was her secret sanctuary. The royal gardeners focused on the grand, manicured displays for the nobility. This smaller, wilder place was left to its own devices, and Aurora had secretly taken over its care. Here, the roses grew in untamed bursts of color, and medicinal herbs sprouted happily between cracks in the flagstones. Here no one could hear her. She pushed the heavy, creaking wooden gate open and stepped inside, the tension in her shoulders immediately easing. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth. She walked along the narrow, overgrown path, her fingers gently brushing the petals of a velvety purple flower. She settled on a weathered stone bench nestled beneath a canopy of twisting wisteria vines, their purple blossoms hanging like clusters of grapes. For a long time she simply sat in the peaceful quiet, listening to the cheerful chirping of sparrows. Finally she began to speak, her voice a soft murmur to the plants that were her only confidants. They all just think I'm broken," she whispered, her words tripping as they always did when her emotions ran high. She looked at a particularly resilient weed pushing its way through the stones. "Sierra, she says I should be quiet. That my words are worthless." A single tear escaped and traced a warm path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. "But I meant not. My hands can heal. My heart can feel things. Why can't they see that? Why do they only hear the st stumbles? Unbeknownst to Aurora, she was not alone. Deep in the dappled shadows of the garden, where the morning sun had not yet reached, a figure sat perfectly still, having sought his own form of solitude. Prince Lupus had come here to escape the weight of his title, the constant, expectant stares of his parents and advisors, all willing him to break his silence. He had been there long before she arrived, a statue amidst the greenery. He watched her enter, saw the way the sadness seemed to lift from her the moment she crossed the threshold. He listened to her whispered, struggling words, not with pity, but with a profound and startling understanding. When she gasped, having finally noticed his movement in the shadows, her hand flew to her heart. "Why, Your Highness? I'm so sorry. I didn't know anyone was here," she stammered, scrambling to her feet as if to flee. "I'll go. This is your garden." But Lupus did not look angry. He did not gesture for her to leave. Instead, he slowly shook his head. Then, with a deliberate slowness that was becoming familiar to her, he raised his hand and pointed to the empty space on the stone bench beside him. It was not a command but an invitation. A question. Aurora's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct told her to curtsy and run, to avoid this impossibly complicated and powerful male. But the memory of his kindness in the hall, the softness she had seen in his eyes, held her in place. Swallowing her fear, she took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was sitting on the very edge of the bench, a respectful foot of space between them. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the heavy, judgmental silence of the grand hall. This was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled only with the sounds of the garden. After several long minutes, Aurora found her voice again, though it was barely a whisper. "You don't talk," she said, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "And I can't talk well." She dared a glance at his profile. He was looking straight ahead, but she knew he was listening with his whole being. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I guess we understand each other a little, don't we?" At that, Lupus turned his head and looked directly at her. The stormy gray of his eyes was calm like a still, misty lake. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a confirmation. A shared truth. Emboldened by this, Aurora began to talk again. She told him about the plants in the garden, her voice growing slightly stronger, her stutter lessening as she spoke about her passion. She pointed to a silvery-leafed plant. "That's moonleaf. It's best picked at night, for dreams." She gestured to a vibrant red flower. "And that scarlet pea petal. A little bit in tea can help a fever, but tea too much is pea poison." She spoke of the soil, the sunlight, the way each plant had its own purpose. Lupus listened, his entire attention focused on her, his eyes following her gestures, occasionally nodding to show he was following. He was the most captive audience she had ever had. This became their new, secret routine. Over the next several days, Aurora would find herself drawn to the walled garden each morning. And each morning, Prince Lupus was already there, waiting. They never made a plan, yet they both kept the unspoken appointment. Their conversations were one-sided, yet it felt like a true dialogue. Aurora would share pieces of her life, her thoughts, her knowledge. Lupus would listen, his silent presence speaking volumes. He would sometimes point to a plant, a silent question, and Aurora would happily explain its uses. He once, very carefully, plucked a perfect, deep blue flower and offered it to her. The gesture was so simple, so pure, it made her breath catch. She took it with a whispered, "Thank you," and pressed it into the pages of her herbal journal later that day. They were two solitary souls, one bound by a self-imposed silence and the other by a struggling voice, finding a rare and beautiful communion in a hidden garden, building a fragile bridge of understanding without a single word being spoken from his lips. The world outside with all its noise and judgment ceased to exist within those ivy-covered walls. The peace of the hidden garden was a precious secret, a bubble of tranquility that existed outside the relentless flow of pack life. For Aurora, the days began to take on a new rhythm. The dread of interaction was softened by the knowledge that each morning held the promise of that quiet bench and the comforting, silent presence of the prince. Her stutter, while still present, felt less like a prison when she knew there was one person who listened to the meaning of her words rather than the sound of them. However, the outside world was not so easily escaped, and the full moon was approaching, a time of heightened energy and ancient traditions for the Shadow Moon Pack. The night of the great bonfire arrived. It was a celebration of the pack's strength and unity, a ritual as old as the pack itself. A massive pyre was built in the center of the main training grounds, its flames reaching so high they seemed to lick the stars from the sky. The air throbbed with the beat of drums and the boisterous voices of hundreds of werewolves. They gathered in groups, feasting on roasted meat, sharing stories, and laughing with an easy, primal joy that Aurora could only observe from a distance. She stood at the very edge of the circle of light, cloaked in shadows, the heat from the fire a stark contrast to the cool isolation she felt. She watched the dancers, their movements wild and free, and a deep, lonely ache settled in her chest. She wished, more than anything, that she could belong so effortlessly. It was then that Sierra found her. The firelight danced in Sierra's eyes, but it was a cruel, mocking light. She had been drinking spiced wine, and her confidence was amplified, her malice sharpened. "Look who decided to join the living," Sierra slurred, her voice carrying over the din. Her friends fanned out behind her, forming a half-circle that trapped Aurora against the dark tree line. "What's the matter? Couldn't find any weeds to talk to tonight? Or are you waiting for your silent friend to come save you again?" The way she said "silent friend" was dripping with insinuation. Aurora tried to stand her ground to push past them, but Sierra stepped closer, her smile a predator's grin. "He must be desperate for company if he spends his time with a stuttering mouse. Or maybe he just pities you. That's it, isn't it?" The mighty prince, so noble, taking pity on the broken little healer. The words were like shards of ice, each one piercing deeper than the last. The laughter of Sierra's friends was a harsh cackle in her ears, mingling with the celebratory drums until it became a single, terrifying noise. The hope she had so carefully nurtured in the garden withered and died under the heat of their scorn. A sob caught in her throat, and this time she couldn't stop it. Tears blurring her vision, she turned and fled, not towards the castle, but into the deep, consuming darkness of the ancient forest that bordered the Pack lands. The sounds of the bonfire faded quickly behind her, swallowed by the thick canopy of trees. The moonlight, so bright in the clearing, became a filtered, ghostly glow here, creating shifting, menacing shadows. Branches clawed at her dress and hair as she ran, driven by a pain that was sharper than any thorn. She didn't know where she was going, she only knew she had to get away. Finally, her breath coming in ragged, tearful gasps, she stumbled into a small, rocky clearing and collapsed against a large moss-covered boulder, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. She was alone, truly and utterly alone in the deep, dark woods. The growl that rippled through the clearing was not the familiar, controlled sound of a pack warrior. This was a raw, guttural and hungry sound that vibrated in the very marrow of her bones. Aurora's head snapped up, her tears freezing on her cheeks. From the inky blackness between the trees, 2 points of malevolent red light appeared. Then another. A massive, mangy wolf emerged into the faint moonlight. It was larger than any normal wolf, its fur matted and filthy, its muzzle pulled back in a vicious snarl that revealed yellowed, dripping fangs. This was a rogue, a werewolf who had lost its mind to its beast, cast out from its pack and now lived only to kill. Its eyes, glowing with feral madness, were locked directly on her. Aurora was paralyzed, a small animal caught in the gaze of a predator. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her tight throat. The rogue took a slow, deliberate step forward, its powerful muscles coiling. It was going to pounce. This was how she would die, alone in the woods, and no one would even know she was gone. But in that exact moment, a silver blur shot from the trees with impossible speed. It was a wolf, but unlike any Aurora had ever seen. It was enormous, easily twice the size of the rogue, its fur a breathtaking tapestry of shimmering silver and charcoal gray. Its presence radiated a power that was both ancient and immense, making the very air crackle with energy. It was Prince Lupus in his true Lycan form. He moved with a grace and fury that was terrifying to behold, intercepting the rogue's lunge midair with a devastating crash of bodies. The fight was a whirlwind of snapping jaws, savage growls and flashes of silver and brown fur under the pale moon. The rogue was savage, but Lupus was a force of nature. His every move was precise, powerful and efficient. He was not just fighting, he was protecting. He placed his own body as a permanent, unbreakable shield between the rogue and Aurora. With a final, powerful swipe of a clawed paw and a deep bite to the rogue's shoulder, Lupus sent the creature yelping in pain, scrambling back into the darkness from whence it came. The clearing fell silent once more, the only sound the heavy, panting breaths of the great silver Lycan. Slowly he turned. His muzzle was stained with the rogue's blood, his eyes still glowed with the faint, ethereal light of the moon, but the feral rage in them had subsided. He looked at Aurora, who was still pressed against the boulder, trembling from head to toe. He took a step towards her, and she flinched instinctively. He immediately stilled, lowering his massive head in a gesture that was clearly meant to be non-threatening. He whined, a soft, low sound that was filled with concern. Then he began to change. His form shimmered, the immense wolf shrinking, reshaping, until Prince Lupus stood before her in his human form once more. His clothes were torn, and a thin trickle of blood ran from a cut on his brow, but his eyes were the same stormy gray, now filled with a desperate worry as he looked at her. He took a slow, cautious step forward. "Are you hurt?" He mouthed the words silently, his hands moving as if to reach for her but stopping short. The dam of fear and shock inside Aurora broke. A fresh wave of tears, these of relief and overwhelming emotion, spilled from her eyes. She shook her head, unable to form any words. Seeing her distress, Lupus closed the distance between them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply opened his arms. Aurora stumbled forward and collapsed against his chest, burying her face in the torn fabric of his shirt. His arms wrapped around her, strong and secure, holding her tightly as she cried. She could feel the rapid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm that slowly began to calm her own frantic pulse. He was solid. He was safe. He had come for her. He had fought a monster for her. He held her until her sobs subsided into shaky breaths, his silent presence a fortress against the terrors of the night. In that embrace, surrounded by the scent of pine, night air, and him, something fundamental shifted between them. The quiet understanding in the garden had been forged into something unbreakable in the fire of battle. This was no longer just companionship. This was something far deeper, and they both knew it. The walk back from the dark forest to the healer's cottage on the edge of the palace grounds was a journey taken in a silence more profound than any they had shared before. It was not the comfortable quiet of the garden, nor the heavy silence of the grand hall. This was a thick, charged atmosphere, humming with the aftermath of terror and the shocking intimacy of what had just transpired. Prince Lupus walked a half-step behind Aurora, a protective, vigilant shadow. His presence was no longer just that of a silent prince, but of a guardian who had shed blood in her defense. Every rustle of the night leaves made her flinch, and every time she did, she felt the intensity of his gaze sharpen, scanning the darkness for any renewed threat. He had saved her life, and then he had held her as she fell apart. The memory of his arms around her, the solid, steady beat of his heart under her ear, was a brand on her soul, warmer and more real than the lingering fear of the rogue. They reached the small, stone-hewn cottage where Aurora lived and worked with the elder healers. A single lantern glowed in the window, a beacon of safety and normalcy. They stopped just outside the wooden door, standing in a small pool of lantern light that made the surrounding night seem even darker. The world was utterly still. The distant sounds of the bonfire had long since died away, and the pack was asleep. It was just the two of them, standing on the threshold between the wild night and the promise of shelter. Aurora turned to face him, her face pale in the soft light, her eyes wide and filled with a turmoil of emotion she couldn't possibly name. The cut on his brow had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark, stark trail down the side of his face. Without thinking, she reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed the dried blood away. He did not move, his eyes watching her every gesture with an intensity that made her breath catch. Her touch was feather-light, a healer's instinct, but it felt like the most intimate act of her life. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and disuse. You have saved me." The words were so inadequate for the debt she felt. He had not just saved her life. He had made her feel for the first time what it was like to be worth defending. Lupus captured her retreating hand in his own, his grip firm but gentle, holding it against his chest, over his heart. He looked down at their joined hands, then back into her eyes. The storm in his gray gaze had quieted into something deep, earnest, and unbearably soft. He brought his other hand up and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away the last trace of a tear stain. The contact sent a cascade of warmth through her entire body. In that moment, surrounded by the silent, sleeping world, the last of her fears melted away, replaced by a feeling of such profound rightness it was dizzying. She looked up at him, at this strong, silent prince who had seen every broken, stuttering part of her and had not looked away. He had fought for her. He had chosen to share his solitude with her. A desperate, hopeful longing swelled in her chest, so powerful it ached. "Lupus," she breathed, his name one of the few words that rarely stumbled on her tongue. I wish I could hear your voice. Just once." Just to know what it sounds like when you say my name." She saw the conflict in his eyes, a deep, internal war waged behind his silent walls. He looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world, as if he were memorizing every detail of her face in the lantern light. He took a slow, deep breath, his chest expanding under her hand. It was a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fleeting second before returning to her eyes, seeking and giving permission all at once. And then he spoke. His voice was low, a rough, gravelly whisper husky from years of disuse. It was the sound of stone grinding against stone, of a deep, frozen river finally cracking in the spring thaw. It was raw and untamed, yet imbued with a tenderness that shattered her completely. He formed one word, one name, pouring a universe of feeling into it. Aurora. It was not just her name. It was a confession. It was a vow. It was the sound of his soul reaching for hers. The way he said it, with such reverence and aching warmth, made it the most beautiful, perfect sound she had ever heard. It was her name, but it was also her heart, her spirit, her very being, acknowledged and cherished. Tears, not of sorrow or fear, but of pure, unadulterated joy, welled in her eyes and streamed down her face freely. She was crying because a locked door inside her had been flung open. She was crying because the silent prince had chosen her to be the one he broke his silence for. He had given her the most precious part of himself that he had to give. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. In that one spoken word he had told her everything. He loved her. He saw her. He was hers. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't. She rose onto her toes to meet him. And then his lips were on hers. The kiss was not hesitant. It was a seal upon the promise he had just spoken. It was gentle, yet filled with a desperate, passionate intensity that had been building in the quiet garden and forged in the fire of the forest. It was sweet, but it was also a claiming and a surrender. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against him, and her hands came up to rest on his shoulders, holding on as the world spun away. All the loneliness, all the mockery, all the pain of a lifetime of being misunderstood dissolved in the warmth of that kiss. She felt whole. She felt heard in a way she never thought possible. She was Aurora, and he was Lupus, and he had spoken her name into the night, making it a sacred word. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, they rested their foreheads together. Aurora's tears had slowed, and a true radiant smile, the first of its kind, broke through like the dawn. She looked into his eyes, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear, strong, and held only the faintest ghost of a stutter. "Lupus," she said again, testing the strength of her own voice against the strength of his. It was steady. It was sure. From that night on, everything changed. When she was with him, in their garden or walking the quiet paths of the palace, her words began to flow more freely. The constant, choking fear of judgment was gone, replaced by the unshakable knowledge that the most important person in her world listened to her, valued her, and had broken a years-long vow of silence for the simple, profound privilege of saying her name. Her voice was finding its strength, because his silence had given it a safe place to land. The change in Prince Lupus did not go unnoticed. Whispers, softer and more curious than the mocking ones that had once followed Aurora, now wound their way through the stone corridors of the palace. The prince was seen walking the grounds, no longer as a solitary brooding shadow, but with the quiet healer girl at his side. And it was the girl who was speaking, her voice growing clearer and more confident with each passing day, while he listened with a focus he reserved for no one else. The servants noted how his stern expression softened in her presence. The guards observed how he always positioned himself subtly between her and any potential disturbance. The silent understanding they shared was a language everyone could see, even if they could not hear it. This shift could not remain a secret from the highest seats of power. The king, a formidable man named Theron with a beard streaked with silver, and the queen, a graceful but sharp-eyed woman named Lyra, watched their son with a mixture of hope and deep confusion. They had long ago resigned themselves to his eternal silence, a grief they bore privately. Now he was emerging from his shell, but for a girl they saw as a commoner, a girl known for a debilitating flaw. They could not understand the bond that had clearly formed, and in their royal world of alliances and strength, misunderstanding quickly bred concern. A formal pack gathering was called in the Grand Hall, the very place where Aurora's humiliation had once unfolded. The cavernous room was filled with the most important members of the Shadow Moon Pack. Warriors, elders, and high-ranking families stood in a vast semicircle, their attention fixed on the royal dais where the king and queen sat. Aurora stood to one side, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, and the old, familiar urge to shrink away threatened to overwhelm her. Across the room she saw Sierra, who watched with a smug, expectant glare, waiting for the rejection she was sure would come. King Theron stood, his voice echoing with authority. "My son," he began, his gaze resting on Lupus, who stood tall and calm beside Aurora. "The pack has seen you break from your solitude. We see you with this young woman. The law and tradition of our people are clear. A future Alpha King must have a queen who strengthens the pack. Before all we must ask, have you, Prince Lupus, chosen Aurora to be your future mate and queen?" The hall fell into a breathless hush. This was the moment. All the whispered rumors, all the speculation, would now be confirmed or shattered. Aurora held her breath, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked at Lupus, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Lupus did not look at his father. He did not look at the crowd. He turned and faced Aurora, his stormy gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that blocked out the entire world. He took her hands in his, a public declaration in itself. Then he turned to face the assembly, his posture radiating a kingly confidence that had been dormant for years. He spoke, and his voice, though used sparingly, was clear and powerful, ringing through the silent hall. "Aurora." The single word was a peal of thunder in the quiet. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The silent prince had spoken again, and once more, it was only for her. But he was not finished. He turned his gaze, now sharp and commanding, across the sea of faces, letting it rest for a moment on Sierra and her followers, who had gone pale. "She is my one true mate," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Her heart is the purest of all. You laughed at her for her stutter, you called her broken, but her quiet strength is what healed my silence. When all of you saw only a prince to be pitied or a future king to be obeyed, she saw a person. She was the only one who looked past my title and into my soul. She is the only one who taught me that my voice was worth hearing, and I am the only one who will ever have the privilege of hearing her true voice." He looked back at Aurora, his expression softening into one of absolute devotion. "She is my choice. She is my queen." Tears streamed down Aurora's face, but they were tears of triumph. Inspired by his unwavering belief, by the love that poured from him and filled her with a courage she never knew she possessed, she stepped forward. She stood beside her prince, shoulder to shoulder, and faced the pack. She looked at the king and queen, then at the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had once mocked her. She took a deep, steadying breath. The words were there, waiting. They did not stumble. They did not falter. They flowed from her with a clarity and strength that silenced the last of the whispers forever. "And he," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and true as a bell, "is the only one who taught me that my voice was always worth hearing. He saw the person I was inside when no one else bothered to look. I accept him, Prince Lupus, as my one true mate and my future king, with all my heart." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then a single warrior, moved by the raw truth of the moment, slammed his fist over his heart in a salute. Another followed. And then another. Soon the entire hall erupted in a roaring cheer that shook the very foundations of the palace. The sound was not one of obligation, but of genuine acceptance and celebration. The king and queen, seeing the profound connection and the undeniable strength their son had found, finally smiled, nodding their regal approval. As the pack celebrated their future king and queen, Lupus drew Aurora into his arms, right there before everyone. "Aurora," he whispered again, for her ears only, the word a tender caress. She smiled, a radiant, joyful smile. "Lupus," she replied, her voice steady and sure. They stood together, the prince who had found his voice in a single name, and the queen who had found her voice in his love. They were two halves of a single soul, once silent and stumbling, now whole and strong, ready to lead their pack into a new, understanding future, forever bound by the powerful, simple truth of a name spoken with love. If you were moved by the journey of Aurora and Lupus, and you wish to follow more tales of love that heals broken silence and strength found in the most unexpected places, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel for more stories where true love triumphs over adversity, where quiet hearts find their powerful voices, and where every ending is a new beginning. Your support helps us bring more of these beautiful narratives to life. Subscribe now and never miss a story.